Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this lunchtime at 12:30-ish. We know that it takes a few minutes in these sessions for everyone to make some tea and log in and settle down. And like us, you're probably all at home, so you'll want to make sure you've put the animals out and the children are entertained while you get comfy for the talk this afternoon. Whilst you're settling in, I'm going to pop a short video on. It's a short film made by British Pathé, and it sets the scene for this afternoon. So I'll pop that on, and then Graham and I will be with you in a couple of minutes. Speak to you in a moment. Thank you.
Dawn takeoff for the Barracuda dive bombers and Hellcats, Wildcats and Corsairs covering the Fleet Air Arm strike at the Tirpitz. Two waves of planes, an hour apart, carried out the assault on the battleship. 42 Barracudas made their operational debut in this daring and completely successful attack. Still lying in Alton Fjord, the Tirpitz had barely recovered from a midget submarine surprise when Vice Admiral Sir Henry Moore sent in his aircraft to administer the knockout. For a fleeting moment, we see the German battleship as she reels under more than 8 tons of bombs, scoring at least 24 hits. They had come from the largest carrier force ever concentrated against a single vessel. 100 minutes after the aircraft had left, the first bomber pilot landed on a carrier's flight deck, bringing word of success. The news was flashed round the ship: the Tirpitz has got bombs all over her. To the men who made the Tirpitz whip under the shock of the detonations goes the signal, hearty congratulations, that's prime.
Marvellous. So, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. My name is Sam Fieldhouse, and I am Community and Education Manager for Wessex Archaeology. In a few minutes, I'll be joined by my colleague Graham, who will be leading our talk this afternoon, and hopefully Catherine from Bristol Libraries is going to say a few words as well. So Graham and I work for Wessex Archaeology, and I appreciate that not all of you joining us this afternoon will have heard of Wessex Archaeology, so I'll tell you briefly what we do. We're a commercial archaeology company and an educational charity. As a commercial archaeology company, our mission is to preserve heritage that is under threat from development. And development could be a housing estate, a new railway line, a wind farm, or anything else that causes building work to be done. Whenever these things are built, they always reveal archaeology. And it's our job to work with the developer to tell the story of the archaeology that that development reveals. Now, we don't just dig things up. We work on land, but we also work at sea and under the sea. We work in the air. We have experts who do research. We record and survey using both flying and underwater remote vehicles, and we interpret the past using reconstructions, 3D prints, and virtual reality. I like to think what we do is pretty cool. You can see some pictures there of some of the vast array of activities we do. The skull in the center being a 3D printed example of a skull that we produced recently. And as an educational charity, we do things like this webinar. As a company, we have no shareholders, so all our profits go into our charitable aim. So we create events that enable you, the public, to learn about the archaeology that we uncover. So what we will do now is I will ask Catherine from Bristol Libraries to say a few words. Catherine, are you there?
Hello, yes I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine. What would you like to say to everyone this afternoon?
Oh, perfect. Brilliant. Thank you. So I just wanted to say hello. My name is Catherine and I'm the Reader Development Librarian at Bristol Libraries. I really just wanted to say a huge thank you to Wessex Archaeology for supporting Bristol Libraries' lunchtime lectures. This lecture today with Graham was planned for earlier in this month to take place at Bristol Central Library. So a huge thank you to Sam for organising this webinar and to Graham for stepping up and volunteering to do it online instead.
That's marvellous. Anytime, Catherine. Can I ask, how many people would you normally have turn up for a lunchtime lecture?
So on average, we get about 30 to 40 attendees, which is about as many as we can fit comfortably in the Holden foyer, which is sort of the main entrance to the Central Library. So I mean, it's wonderful. I can see there's a lot of people online at the moment, and it's great to have such an audience. That's fantastic.
It's brilliant. And of course, the wonderful thing about doing it online is we've got people signing in from all sorts of places. So currently we've got 98 people listening in, all across the Southwest, and I think further afield. So if you're further afield, do let us know in the questions where you're from. So thank you for that, Catherine. It's a pleasure anytime. We love working with museums, galleries and libraries and archives all across the country. So we're always happy to support this kind of activity. I'm going to bring in now Graham, who is going to be leading our session. Graham, are you there?
I am, thanks, Sam.
Fantastic. I'm just handing you the presentation. Wow, I've just heard we have Jonathan Ferguson. Jonathan Ferguson is joining us from Toronto in Canada. A very warm welcome, Jonathan. I dread to think what time of day it is for you over there. And we've got a couple of people over in Hampshire on the Hamble. Marvellous. So, Graham, over to you.
Thanks, Sam. Can you just confirm, Sam, that you can see the presentation slides that I'm giving?
We have visuals and we have sound, Graham, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Catherine. Those of you who attend Bristol Library's lunchtime talks at the Central Library, you may have already heard me speak about shipwrecks. In fact, most recently about a South Australian in the Bristol Channel, a project about the wreck of a very rare migrant ship. However, for today's wreck, I'm going to take you into the air. Although, as I am a marine archaeologist, you can probably guess that that aircraft is going to come from the sea. Now, in keeping with the other talks I've been given, I've been asked to present to a general but engaged audience. Nevertheless, if there are any specialists out there, specialists in aviation or any aircraft engineers, I still hope there's going to be enough in this talk to keep you interested. Now, IFA2 is a new electricity interconnector cable between Hampshire and Normandy in France. It's a joint venture between our national grid and RTE in France. By connecting the British and French electricity grids, it enables up to 1,000 megawatts of power to be transferred between Britain and France. It involves laying a cable along a 200-kilometre route across the English Channel, of course La Manche to the French, or perhaps Chaîne Anglaise, if we want to give a nod to both nations. Now, the route of the cable was designed as far as possible to avoid the wrecks of ships and aircraft on the seabed. However, the Channel has always been a busy place. A front line more than once, with major ports and naval bases, the seabed is littered with historic wrecks. Nowhere is more littered with this archaeological detritus of war and mischance than the Solent, which you will see I'm pointing to with my mouse up here. And amongst the wreckage on the seabed are a good deal of unexploded ordnance, or UXO, bombs, mines, shells, and small arms ammunition. These have the potential to cause catastrophe if the cable is laid on top of them. So the entire route in the Solent had to be surveyed and inspected by UXO contractors. And as a result of this, in July 2018, a UXO diver investigating a lump on the seabed found using multi-beam sonar and metal detecting off Leon Solent here, discovered that it was something more interesting than a boulder or UXO. As the archaeologists for the scheme, we were therefore called in to carry out further investigations. And what had first been described as just metal debris turned out to be the remains of an old military aircraft. It was lying on clay, which had prevented it from sinking completely into the seabed. Now, military aircraft wrecks are protected from disturbance by legislation in the UK. That landed National Grid with a problem. They weren't able to route their cable safely around it because bending a cable can cause issues with overheating. So they'd have to recover it under license. Therefore, over the period of 5 weeks, between May and June 2019, last year, the aircraft was recovered from the seabed by a team comprising specialist marine contractors and ourselves. Now, there was evidence that it might be a naval aircraft, so a team from the Fleet Air Arm Museum, starring their experts David Morris and William Gibbs, was also involved. And in this image here, you can see a large part of the remains of the aircraft awaiting transport off the recovery vessel to the museum, each piece having already been recorded and labelled. Now, although the aircraft was not complete, most of it had survived. This is a 3D model we produced after videoing the wreck during the diving. In fact, I took the video that the model was produced from. And the smaller image is a side-scan sonar image, which shows the site and the wider seabed around. Now, this is a view looking down with an aircraft silhouette superimposed. Only part of the aircraft was actually exposed on the seabed. The rest had to be dug out. It was lying upright on the clay, as you can see in the lower right image. It had a single engine, but a large cockpit. The propeller blades had all broken off. The tail had also broken off and was missing, but fragments of it were found under the aircraft. It had what we call a high wing design, and therefore was lying over on its left wing, with the wingtip lying on the seabed. The unsupported right starboard wing had become detached sometime after the aircraft had been lost and had fallen onto the seabed below. Fortunately for us, there was no large ordnance, such as bombs or a torpedo, and no human remains were found. Unsurprisingly, given that it had been in seawater for decades, the wreckage that could be seen when the aircraft was first found was in a very poor condition, and there was some evidence that it might have been hit at some time by the scallop dredgers that operate in this part of the Solent. However, the parts of the aircraft that had been buried were in much better condition. And a large metal dive brake or flap, which you can see in the photograph on the left-hand side, was recovered from the wreck. You can see it here. Follow my mouse on the silhouette below, and here on the 3D model. Flaps are normally used to reduce an aircraft's stalling speed and therefore their takeoff and landing speeds. However, dive bombers also used what are effectively extra flaps to control their dives. By lowering them against the airflow, they created drag. This in turn reduced the dive bomber's dive speed, enabling the pilot to avoid exceeding what is called the red line speed. Now, not only did this allow the pilot to stay in control, it helped him to drop his bombs more accurately. Now, perhaps the most famous dive bomber, the German Stuka, had air brakes. This image of a Stuka is from a British wartime publication called Know Your Enemy. Now, the Stuka's dive brakes were mounted under the wings. However, the flap that was recovered from our site, our wreck, had been attached to the trailing after edge of the wing, and it was identified as a Youngman flap, a British design. Now, the engine turned out to be a Merlin 27-litre liquid-cooled piston engine designed by Rolls-Royce. This is, well, I was going to say perhaps, but I would say perhaps undoubtedly the most famous aero engine of them all. And it was an engine that powered iconic aircraft such as the Spitfire and Lancaster. Subject to much upgrading during the Second World War, as the Allied and Axis air forces competed to produce the best aircraft. And this particular engine turned out, when it was examined, to be a Merlin 32. Now, this variant was designed for maximum power at low altitude and was mainly used by the Fleet Air Arm. A bearing identification plate was stamped FM, indicating that it was made by Fairey Aviation. There are other signs for this as well. The silver colour found inside the plane, the silver paint colour, and also the black colour of components, all believed to be typically Fairey's. If you look on the left, this is something to do with the engine. These are cordite-filled blank cartridges used for starting the engines. And they were removed just down here. They were removed by the UXO team that we had on board and safely destroyed. Now, the tail wheel, which you can see middle top, was found nearby, not actually during the recovery operations, but by the survey that we carried out beforehand. And in the considerable gloom on the seabed, I found this object by the simple expedient of tripping over it whilst I was diving. Now, we don't know how it became detached, although the tail of the aircraft, as I've already said, was missing. And also on the top left, you'll see this interesting object. This is an arrestor hook, and it was found under the rear fuselage. Now, arrestor hook is only fitted to those aircraft designed to operate from an aircraft carrier, and is therefore an obvious characteristic of Fleet Air Arm aircraft. Evidence of the aircraft having folding wings was also found. The middle lower image is of the hydraulic rams and fittings that would have helped to fold the port wing. And folding wings are characteristic of aircraft designed to operate from aircraft carriers because they have to be maneuvered and stored in much smaller spaces than are usually available to aircraft operated from airfields. And here's a close-up of the arrestor hook. And I want you to note from this that it doesn't look very worn. In fact, it looks quite new. All the muck you can see on it is everything that's accumulated on it while it's been on the seabed. And the fact that it looks new will be of significance later on when we look at which aircraft this was. Here you can see how an arrestor hook was used. It was lowered on approach to the aircraft carrier flight deck, and the idea was that the pilot would effectively catch the hook on steel wires rigged across the deck. And if you look carefully, you can just see the lower arrestor hook underneath the aircraft to the left of the main undercarriage, just there. The wires on the flight deck obviously had a bit of give, but would nevertheless quickly bring the aircraft to a halt, hopefully without giving the pilot whiplash. Now, arrestor hooks made it easier to land on a carrier and reduced the very real risk that the pilot would overshoot. This was embarrassing if you had to go round again and make another attempt to land, but it was also potentially fatal if you hit the superstructure or something on deck, or, heaven forbid, failed to gather enough speed to take off again, and the aircraft ran out of deck and fell into the sea. The consequences of that in the days before ejector seats were usually fatal. Now, behind the engine on our wreck proved to be a large 3-section cockpit, which indicated that the aircraft had a crew of 3. Now, whilst the cockpit was much damaged and the perspex canopy that went over it was not in place, we could tell some things about it. Now, although the aircraft clearly had no forward-firing guns, it's a bit of a clue in itself, and no machine guns were actually found on site, the magazines of a twin K-gun were found scattered around the wreck. These .303 British machine guns were used in single or twin mounts. Here you can see a single K-gun carried on the back of the cockpit of what I think is a British Fairey battle. If there are any Fairey battle specialists out there who can either confirm or deny, then please do so in your questions. However, perhaps the most famous users of the K-guns were the Long-Range Desert Patrol Group, the forerunners of the famous SAS. Here you can see a twin K-gun mounted on one of the jeeps in the North African desert. K-guns, being aircraft guns, defensive guns, were designed to fire as rapidly as possible because you only got a short period of time in which to engage an approaching fighter. And that meant they had tremendous firepower, which was great for the SAS and their hit and run tactics. Now, although damaged, the cockpit contained other fascinating material. A large radio was found, which you can see upper center and upper right. And in this image, where it can be seen newly recovered onto the dive barge by one of the divers. A lovely artifact, that. And this is interesting. This is a Morse key. And this is something you sat on. It's the bucket seat of, I believe it was the pilot. I'll have to check that. But we also found seat fittings and padding. Now, to the right of the perspex window you can see up here is something interesting, which gave us another clue about the aircraft. By the way, the perspex window was found under the aircraft, almost as though it had been popped out, and perhaps that's another clue that I'll come back to later. But in the middle, top, is a shield or cover for a radar set used by an observer. Now, radar was a major advantage for any aircraft expected to locate targets in the wide expanse of the sea. So this was another very clear clue that this was a naval aircraft. Now, toilets are not, of course, a normal feature of small combat aircraft, or really any combat aircraft in the Second World War. And I direct your attention to the alternative down here, which is a comfort bag, also found in the cockpit. And this is a particularly nice find. It's the pilot's rubber oxygen mask. We also found some dangerous things because a tube-shaped holder was found to contain 2 smoke floats. Now, these contained phosphorus and were pyrotechnics that were dropped as markers in emergencies. And because they contained phosphorus, it meant that it was too dangerous to bring the floats to the surface, because phosphorus ignites spontaneously in air, and try as you might, you won't be able to extinguish it. So instead, they were removed and safely destroyed on the seabed by the UXO diver working with us after being recorded. These are very nice. These are large batteries, also found in the cockpit, and they proved that the aircraft had a 24-volt supply. Now, remarkably, the batteries, when recovered to the surface, still proved to retain a very small charge. And equally remarkably, fire extinguishers were also found that still appeared to be pressurized. This is a compass made in Liverpool, which was found in the rear of the fuselage. Now, it was there because it was the master unit, and this needed to be away from large ferrous objects that could interfere with the compass readings. And as the engine was the main culprit, the compass was positioned as far from it as possible. The crew instead had access to a repeater in the cockpit. This comes from the right wing and is made of brass, and it's a pitot tube, and it was made in Taunton. And this was used to measure airspeed, and the tube would be mounted as far out on the wing as possible to reduce the effect of turbulence on the readings. We also found bomb crutches, bomb mountings under both wings, and the remains of a torpedo crutch under the fuselage, which clearly demonstrated the aircraft was a torpedo bomber as well as a dive bomber. Now, although I will probably not surprise you by saying that we'd pretty much satisfied ourselves at a fairly early stage what the aircraft was, all of this evidence and more pointed towards the fact that it could really be none other than one of these, a fleet-air-arm Fairey Barracuda. Now, Britain was what we would perhaps these days call an early adopter when it came to operating aircraft from ships at sea. Indeed, we were very much pioneers of naval aviation. We launched our first aircraft from a ship in 1925, and in 1915 at Gallipoli, the Royal Air Service, or I should say the Royal Naval Air Service, carried out the first torpedo bomber attack. And in 1917, we carried out the first landing on a moving ship. And this is an early landing, I believe, on HMS Furious in 1917. You can see that this ship, converted into an aircraft carrier, didn't have a full-length flight deck. Instead, if the pilot overshot, the hope was that this aircraft would be caught in the steel wire barrier in front of him, and that he wouldn't be hurt or drowned if his aircraft instead fell off the side of the ship, which they were wont to do. Now, our naval aviators were very brave. They were certainly willing to risk their lives. And in my opinion, they were possibly even crazed men, because they landed on postage stamp sized flight decks on often pitching and rolling ships with the near certainty of death if they got it badly wrong. In the interwar years following the First World War, our fleet air arm introduced the arrested landings that I've talked about. It adopted catapults to launch some aircraft. It introduced the flush deck aircraft carriers that I was talking about. And yet, despite these technical advances, when we entered the war, our naval aircraft were pretty much second rate. Most were biplanes, such as the very slow Fairey Swordfish. And the Fleet Aeron's only modern monoplanes were the Skewer and the Rock, made by Blackburn. Now, with a maximum speed of only 225 miles an hour, they compared very unfavourably with the 330 mile an hour plus that the RAF's Hurricanes and Spitfires could manage at the time. This was at least partly the result of the fact that although the Fleet Aeron had been formed in 1924, it was part of the Royal Air Force, and it didn't come under the control of the Admiralty, i.e. the Navy, until 1939. Now, the RAF's priority was understandably the defence of the British mainland, and not its fleet. At a time when the aircraft carrier was taking over from the battleship as the decisive weapon at sea, Britain, unfortunately, entered the war with a fleet that was ill prepared for the challenges ahead. And catch-up was required. Now, despite a slow beginning, the Fleet Aeron went from 225 carrier-based aircraft at the start of the war to 59, yes, 59, not aircraft, but aircraft carriers at the end of it, with 1,300 first line and 2,500 second line aircraft. Now, whilst the Royal Navy relied very heavily on great American naval aircraft, such as the Wildcat, the Hellcat, the Corsair, and Avenger, to transform itself into the modern carrier strike force that came to dominate the seas during the war, new British aircraft introduced during that war also had a big impact. I'm thinking the Hawker Sea Hurricane, the Fairey Fulmar, the Supermarine Seafire, the Spitfire at sea, the superb Hawker Sea Fury, perhaps one of the best piston engine fighters ever built, and the much derided Fairey Barracuda. Now, the torpedo bombers that the Fleet Aeron started the war with were biplanes, the Albacore and the famous Swordfish, made by the British company Fairey Aviation. Despite its obsolete design and performance, however, torpedoes dropped from Swordfish jammed the Bismarck's rudder, ensuring its destruction, and did grievous damage to the Italian fleet at Taranto, helping to alter the balance of power in the Mediterranean. But they looked old-fashioned and they were slow, achingly slow if it was you flying towards a heavily defended target. As is usual in the services, humour was the crew's response. And I've heard the following tale about an American and a British sailor talking about a Fairey Swordfish. The American sailor says, "Gee, who makes them?" The British sailor, "Fairies." American sailor, "That figures. Now, skill and gallantry can only take you so far. What was needed was a new aircraft to replace these obsolete aircraft." The famous American Grumman Avenger was imported, but work had already started on a new homegrown replacement. And this was the Barracuda, or specification S2437, as it was imaginatively first known. And that specification called for a naval aircraft capable of being deployed from an aircraft carrier and therefore with folding wings, or from an airfield, able to fulfill the functions of a torpedo bomber, a dive bomber, and a reconnaissance aircraft, hence the radar. The first prototype flew in 1940, the second in 41. There were delays in starting production, and it wasn't until May 1942 that the Mark I version of the new aircraft entered service. The improved Mark II followed with a famous Merlin engine that equipped the Spitfire and the radar that allowed the aircraft to detect surface vessels. And over 1,700 were built by Fairey and their rivals such as Blackburn and Boulton Paul. More than 850 of the Mark IIIs with much more powerful Griffon engines followed them. And in January 1943, the first frontline squadron was equipped with these aircraft. Now, the Barracuda was certainly advanced on the Albacore and the Swordfish. It's a monoplane with a crew of 3. It had a decent engine. It had the radar. It had carrier-friendly folding wings. The Mark II version had a range of almost 640 miles, even when carrying a torpedo. However, it was certainly no looker, as you can see from this. It also lacked a forward-firing gun. And despite the undoubted pedigree of its engines, it also lacked speed. And its engines also proved to be asthmatic in hot climates, which limited its impact and effectiveness when the British fleet transferred its efforts to the Pacific in the closing months of the war. Now, a cockpit sign on the aircraft that we recovered refers to assisted takeoff. This indicates that what were known as RATOGs were being used, small rockets designed to assist takeoff and then fall away from the aircraft. Here's, I think it's, somebody's going to have forgotten what that is. It's taking off from carrier to fighter, it's taking off from a carrier, and you can see the 2 plumes of smoke that are spreading out in a fan from the rockets. If somebody could remind me what aircraft that is at the end, if you know, please.
Is it a Sea Fury, Graham?
You've got it. Yes, brilliant. Thank you very much. And we found 3 of them, although they were designed to fall away from the aircraft after takeoff, we found 3 of them in the vicinity of the wreck. Of course, we can't prove, especially as we're close to the runway at Lyon Solent, that they are from our aircraft. Now, being a dive bomber, the aircraft was fitted with dive flaps or air brakes, the Youngman flaps, and these helped during carrier landings, reducing the likelihood of coming in, I think the expression may be too hot and overshooting. Applying the air brakes at relatively high speed whilst also applying the rudder, however, could throw the aircraft into a very dangerous inverted dive. I don't fly, but even to me that sounds dangerous. This was a particular danger for inexperienced pilots who didn't know the aircraft's little peculiarities, and several accidents occurred during practice flights before the problem was identified. But still, the aircraft was never a favourite, the inexperienced. And it was also linked to a high number of unexplained crashes, usually involving inexperienced pilots. Eventually, during 1945, the cause was traced to small leaks that developed in the hydraulic fluid control systems, most commonly, unfortunately for the pilot, in his pressure gauge. And what would happen is that this fault would occur and the leaking gauge would spray hydraulic fluid straight into the pilot's face. Unpleasant enough, but particularly serious because hydraulic fluid also contained ether. And as few of the pilots used oxygen masks below 10,000 feet, or used them anyway, the pilot who suffered that misfortune would become unconscious extremely quickly, and the aircraft would then inevitably crash. And these problems and the Barracuda's occasionally rather clumsy flying qualities, particularly in the hands of the inexperienced, inspired mirth as well as concern. And this was reflected in the jokes that those who did not fly the aircraft told. It was said this is a really old and corny one, that it was a flying prostitute because it had no visible means of support. I'm sure that's been said about a lot of military aircraft. It was also said about it that although the Barracuda is a wonderful invention, it will never take the place of an aircraft. Now, mess songs were sung about it, including this ditty to the tune of "You Must Remember This" from the 1942 film Casablanca. Don't worry, I'm not going to try and sing it, but if you can imagine, if you don't know the film, it goes something like this: "You must remember this, a barras poras," and I'll miss that messroom language out. On that you can rely, no matter what the future brings, it will not fly. Those in the military who get to use kit that has a certain reputation are often the first to send it up. Barracuda pilots, the butt of their comrades' humour, were typical and invented the following song. Those of you who are old enough to remember the tune of "Any Old Iron" will know that this is "Any old iron, any old iron, any old iron. Down at Lee, you get them free, built by ferries for a crew of 3. Bags of fun, no front gun, an engine you can't rely on. You know what you can do with your Barracuda too? Old iron, old iron." And yet, despite this sending up and all the problems that the Barracuda could bring to an inexperienced pilot, like its predecessor, the Swordfish, it turned out to be an effective aircraft. Too late for serious action in the Med, northern latitudes, it was just the aircraft that the Royal Navy needed. Barracudas carry out devastating attacks on German convoys off Norway, and in April 1944, 42 aircraft launched from the carriers Victorious and Furious dive-bombed the very heavily defended German battleship you can see here, the notorious Tirpitz, hitting it with 14 bombs and putting it out of the war for 2 months. In the Far East, despite its asthmatic engines, it was almost the right aircraft. Despite having to fly over high mountains, it still managed to achieve success against targets in the East Indies. It then served quietly, mainly as a trainer, well into the 50s. Whilst it may not have been a great or a beautiful aircraft, never let anyone tell you that the Barracuda didn't earn its spurs. Okay, it's a Fairey Barracuda. But which Barracuda? When was it lost? Was anyone lost with it? Well, a serial number for the engine was found. You'll see it says Merlin. And the Rolls-Royce Heritage Centre kindly confirmed that it was built in Derby between September and December 1943. So our aircraft was lost no earlier than September 1943. Now, the aircraft is just off the end of the runway of the former HMS Tidal at Lyon Solent. This was an extremely important fleet air arm base that originated back to the First World War, and plenty of Barracudas are known to have flown from there. It was overwhelmingly likely, therefore, that the aircraft was based at Daedalus. Now, remember I said about the unworn arrestor hook? Well, that indicated that it was a fairly new aircraft. Now, 2 Daedalus Barracudas are recorded as having been lost near the airfield around about that time. Both were fairly new. Number BV739 was lost in September 1943 when it lost power during takeoff and crashed in shallow water. However, this is uncomfortably close to the earliest date of manufacture of the engine. Furthermore, this aircraft was made by Bolt & Paul under license, whereas the manufacturer's marks and tags on other indications on the wreck suggested that it had been built by Fairey's. An LS473 is a better fit. Also lost on takeoff, but in January 1944, This aircraft had been built by Fairey's and had been delivered the previous November. The wreck had an internal paint scheme that was also characteristic of Fairey's, as I've said. This aircraft was also recorded as carrying a torpedo when lost. LS-473 is recorded to have ditched, and ditching with a torpedo was not a wise thing to do, and an urgent action that the pilot would have taken as soon as he realized he was in trouble was to ditch the torpedo. No torpedo has been found with the wreck, but a torpedo retaining cable was found. This was normally taken off the aircraft if a torpedo wasn't being carried, because it could whip around and cause damage. Now, LS-473 was being piloted by this man, Sub-Lieutenant Sandays. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. If anybody can tell me, please let me know. And he was a member of the RNVR. And he's recorded in his squadron log as having had to swim 2 miles back to shore, which, if you know the Solent and its strong tides and the coldness of the water at that time of year, you will know would not have been a mean feat at all. And it is perhaps the reason why parts of a flying boot and a jumper were found in the aircraft, possibly ditched before he jumped into the water, and why at least one of the perspex windows of the aircraft, remember I mentioned that before, appeared to have been deliberately popped out. I'm glad to be able to tell you that the sub-lieutenant survived. However, whilst his aircraft is currently the lead candidate, unfortunately, records of Barracuda losses are incomplete, and there, as far as I am aware, is still no proof that his was the aircraft that we found. Perhaps a combination of serial numbers will eventually provide the proof. In the meantime, the flying boot is marked size 12, and the sub-lieutenant's son, who lives in Canada, has been contacted about his father's shoe size. Now, that is not quite the end of the story, because the question is, why were the Fleet Air Arm Museum involved, and what is the significance of this discovery and its recovery? Well, I can tell you this: the Barracuda, like very many of our historic aircraft, became extinct. In other words, it did not survive in use or preservation, or even as the gate guards you sometimes still see outside of airfields. And because of this, the Fleet Air Arm Museum have had a very long-running aim to rebuild a Fairey Barracuda from wreck parts. And this aim was instigated all the way back in, I think it's the 1970s, and I have to check that, but I think it was the 1970s, not perhaps the 80s, when a Fairey Barracuda, or parts of one, were recovered from a lock in Northern Ireland, and that aircraft had crashed in August 1944, sadly with the loss of all 3 crew. And in total now, the Fleet Air Arm Museum have parts from 4 Barracudas, plus other miscellaneous parts, and are starting to try to reassemble one. Now, unfortunately, no detailed manufacturing and assembly drawings exist, so parts are rather difficult to make from scratch or to replicate replacement parts, which is where the Fairey Barracuda that was recovered by IFA2 is playing its part, because this aircraft was less heavily distorted by its crash than aircraft that crash on land tend to be. And therefore, you're getting a lot of parts, or the Fleet Aero Museum getting a lot of parts from this aircraft that are in a pretty good condition, and in even better condition once they have been conserved by the Fleet Aero Museum. Who would believe that that object up there, after conservation, now looks like that? And if I show you this, that is on the right. That is not a new parts bin. Those are parts that have been recovered from this aircraft wreck and cleaned up. Now, I have to say to you that aircraft parts recovered by the sea tend to be rather unstable. We're not entirely sure what the long-term future of them is, but at the moment the signs are good, and the fact that they've been returned to some sort of stability, and that is very much down to this man and Will Gibbs of the Fleet Aero Museum and his volunteers who have been spending many hours on the project. Now, here's a little bit of a plug for the Fleet Aero Museum and their restoration project. It's going to cost, they estimate, at least £100,000 to rebuild the Fairey Barracuda. Incidentally, will not fly, but it should be a pretty good replica. And like all museums, even national museums, funds are extremely tight, and there's a fundraising campaign going on. So when things start to settle down and maybe we get back to normal life, and you feel that you would like to support this project, and you can go to their Facebook page. I believe it's currently inactive, but as soon as they get back to work, this will be starting up again. Then please do so. Just remains for me to finally thank my senior colleagues on this project. I was a diver archaeologist, wasn't on it for the whole thing, and my colleagues Ewan, Alistair and Ben were very much my lead colleagues. Also thanks to Will Gibbs and Dave Morris, Fleet Aero Museum, of course the I42 Project, National Grid, Representative Jake Stevens, and the Marine Contractors, who put a lot of work into recovering this really important aircraft, James Fisher. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Graham. We've had lots and lots of questions. So I think what we'll do, we're going to put on a short film, which is a couple of minutes, and I will digest all the questions, and then we'll be back with you in a couple of minutes and we'll go through all the questions. So we'll get that film on now.
So the I42 project is a high voltage electricity interconnector that connects Great Britain to France. The I42 project came across this item during a UXO search. It's very important to have the right people available in the team and to support the team who can advise correctly.
We were contracted to IFA2 National Grid as their retained archaeologists. So we were providing archaeological support in a variety of roles and circumstances throughout the development. The survey clearance divers identified aircraft material. That was reported to us. The Fleet Aero Museum identified it quickly as being a Fairey Barracuda, and that was of tremendous interest to them because of their ongoing Barracuda reconstruction project.
The aircraft that we're attempting to recreate, that's a Barracuda Mark II. The Fairey Barracuda is a particularly important aircraft from World War II. More than 2,500 ordered for the Royal Navy. That's more than any other individual type of aircraft ever ordered and built for the Navy, yet not a single one exists today.
We've had a unique experience. To the best of our knowledge, this is possibly the first time an entire aircraft has been archaeologically recovered within UK waters. One of the key things And one of the hardest things to obtain when you're looking at historic aircraft are those unique moulded parts and unique specially manufactured parts. And what we've discovered through the process of this project is we've recovered hundreds, if not thousands, of these items, which will just help facilitate the rebuild program. One of the nicest things is to know that the end result for all the hard work by all the teams involved will be that we are contributing to a restoration project that in the long term will be here for the generations to come to look at and enjoy.
Right, everyone, so thank you for that. Graham, I'm going to switch on your webcam so people can see you, and then we'll take some questions, I think. You're still there?
Hi, Sam.
Hello, brilliant. So
Hi.
we've got some questions from people. Yeah, so are you happy for me to fire away with those?
Yep.
Marvellous. Excellent, we can see you now as well. That's fantastic. So the first question we have is from Matt Davies, and he asks, do you have to apply to multiple government offices like the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Office for assistance whilst recovering a wreck?
Well, the recovery was paid for by IFA2. We did need permission because all military aircraft wrecks on the seabed are automatically protected from interference. So we did need a license from the MOD and also from the Marine Management Organisation. So we needed a license to disturb the wreck, to recover it. We also needed a license to disturb the seabed. That was all obtained. And the work, as I say, was entirely funded by the I42 project.
Marvellous. And someone else was asking as well about the cost of these projects. And I think it's worth saying that it is within the planning system. I think I'm correct in saying, Graham, that the developer must pay for the archaeology.
Yes, there's the principle that whatever either effectively the government, or the local government or national government decides about what archaeology needs to be done, the principle in this country is that the developer pays, not just for the actual work on site, but also for all the things that need to be done in advance or subsequently, like expert analysis, writing reports, etc. We're fortunate that we had a museum that was willing to take the wreckage of the Fairey Barracuda. You know, the stars aligned for this particular aircraft.
Marvellous, thank you. And the next question, a slightly simpler one. How deep was the wreck in the Solent?
Oh, it was only a few meters deep. It was very close to the shore. That's not to say the conditions weren't challenging. I've been down on the aircraft wreck a few times. Visibility could be less than a meter. So it's a bit like doing at times it's a bit like doing archaeology with a blindfold on. You also get very strong currents, so you can't work all day. You can only work for relatively short periods when the tidal current slows down enough so that somebody can get in the water without being dragged away by the current. So there are natural constraints, and of course if you get bad weather that whips up the waves, and you get to a certain height of waves you can't work on the site. So it's a site that's not without challenges, but very satisfying to be involved in as a diver.
And how long was the process from when we first were brought involved to it kind of being out of the water and in the museum? How long did all that take?
Several months, not because it couldn't be done more quickly, but because it had to be organised and it had to be done safely, and it also had to be done with the necessary permissions, and you can't just whistle those up. You have to go through a process. Speaking as a diver, that's the sort of process I want these projects to go through, because I want to know that I'm going to be safe. I also want to know that the aircraft is looked after properly, that the correct license conditions are applied, and that enough archaeology gets done. So these things can't really be rushed.
Absolutely. And when we brought it up, how was the integrity of the aircraft as it was lifted?
It wasn't brilliant. In fact, it was. Sadly, I had to go off on another project at that time. So my colleagues Alistair and Ben were there helping the marine contractors to recover the aircraft. Now, it became very clear early on that it wasn't strong enough to be recovered in one piece. So it was, in effect, disassembled on the seabed and recovered in bits.
Marvellous.
I should say we had one of the advantages of the fact that it was developer funded is that they brought in a crane barge. So they had all the proper equipment there and could recover these objects. And they had specialist marine contractors who are used to lifting large, heavy things off the seabed.
And there were no, you said that there were no human remains in it, and we know there was a pilot on board, of course. Would there have been any other crew in it when it ditched?
No, we believe that the sub-lieutenant was on his own in the plane. That wasn't particularly unusual for training flights.
Okay.
We don't know the exact circumstances of the flight because we don't have that information from the records. But I think maybe as research goes on, more things might be found that will give more of a clue.
So the aircraft could have been flown single-handed. That wasn't an issue.
Yes, it could be. It could be flown. It couldn't be operated to its full capabilities with just the pilot on board.
I see. Okay. Duncan Ross is asking, has any more archaeology been found on the France-UK power line route? Do we know of any?
Yes, I believe that more archaeology has been found, but I'm not the person to ask, I'm afraid. I was just involved in this particular one. There has also been, well, I tell a lie there, because I was involved in recovering part of a shipwreck, a wooden shipwreck. And that, again, was on the cable route. They couldn't lay the cable around it because if you bending the cable, which can create overheating problems. So we had to study that on the seabed and then recover it. It wasn't a huge thing, it was just part of a hull. But we had to deal with it and recover it in a similar way to the aircraft. So again, a crane barge was involved. We got it up to the surface in bits because we weren't sure that it was strong enough to be recovered in whole. And then subsequently we've recorded it, and it's going to be, a report has been done, and it's going to be published so that people will be able to read all about it.
Brilliant. Someone asked them, it was Jonathan Ferguson asked, when you were showing a picture in your presentation, there appeared to be small winglets or some vertical winglets on the top wing surface of the aircraft. Do we know what they would have been for?
Well, I think what you might be referring to is the fact that quite a lot of the upper skin of the wing was missing. So you're looking through and you're seeing the ribs of the wing itself.
Okay.
I suspect that's what he's seen.
I see. And a question.
Should have made that clear.
No, that's all right. A question about the. We recovered 2 Vickers magazines. Did they contain any ammunition? And if so, can we use ammunition as dating evidence?
Yes, they weren't recovered because the UXO.
Of course.
Yes, ammunition can be used as dating evidence, but you've got to remember it's not necessarily that finer evidence. I have been involved in the recovery of some of the wreckage of the B-29 in the southern North Sea that was found as a result of similar work in the context of an offshore wind farm. And we got a date of a machine gun bullet that gave us an earliest date when that aircraft could have been lost. But what it didn't do was give us a last possible date. We just knew it was a manufacturing date, but it could have been, it could have still been in use several, still be unfired several months later.
Marvelous, thank you. So there's we've got a couple of people on the call from quite far afield, actually, because we've got people in London, Kent, Wales and Sussex, but we've got someone in Canada, we've got Wayne in Australia, and John in the USA. So John, who's in Florida, says he works for the USA ex-British Aircraft Corporation, and he was just agreeing with how dangerous it can be diving on these wrecks. He said some of the aircraft had anti-handling charges built into them that were there to prevent the enemy from taking them apart, or almost kind of self-destruct devices.
Right. Okay. Well, this type of project, because let me anticipate the question, this type of project, you'll always have a UXO specialist on board.
Ah, okay.
Usually they can dive. So if we will do our research in advance, what sort of UXO could we come across? And that will obviously be informed by the UXO experts. And we'll try to anticipate while we're doing that. So the person first into the cockpit will be the UXO diver, that sort of thing.
Brilliant. And just Joanna has just asked about licensing. So who is it that issues us with a license to dive on a wreck?
Well, it depends what sort of wreck it is. Most wrecks you can dive on. You can dive on a military aircraft without having a license. But if you want to do anything with it, if you want to interfere with it, if you want to recover anything, then you need to have a license. You can. It's quite a complicated field, but certainly in terms of aircraft, there aren't many restrictions. But if you want to take an object to study or to just as a souvenir, then there are restrictions, and you have to be careful with that because you can easily commit an offence.
Thank you for that.
One thing that should dispel, Sam, if I can,
of course.
A lot have the idea that things on the seabed are automatically considered to be abandoned. That's not the case, and that's particularly not the case in respect of aircraft. So you've got to remember that military aircraft will still have an owner, and that owner will still normally be a government. So you can get yourself into quite a bit of trouble if you don't do your research in advance.
I imagine. And a nice pointer, actually, someone has commented and said, if anyone is interested in oral history of the flaws of the Barracuda from a contemporary test pilot, there's an oral history available from the Fleet Air Arm website by a chap called D.P. Davies. It's an interview, and he is apparently quite disparaging of the flight characteristics of the aircraft.
Yes, I would certainly recommend. One of the most interesting aspects of this sort of period of archaeology, we think we know. I like the whole social history side of things. I like the fact that this is, doing this talk has got me to look at mess room songs and things. But also I like the technical. A lot of the things you deal with, if you're dealing with what you could call sort of conflict archaeology, in other words, the wrecks of First and Second World War ships and aircraft at sea, you've got a lot of instructional material readily available on things like YouTube, the sort of thing that would have been watched by engineers and whatever back in the day when these things were actually in operation. That's really good. We tend to think we know everything about things that are recent, but experience with the Barracuda and the fact that there's very little in the way of parts diagrams and really detailed plans, and the fact that this aircraft is actually extinct, does tell us that that is not the case, and that we really need to value these wrecks and these aircraft.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Catherine to just say a few final words from Bristol Libraries. So, Catherine, we are shortly coming back to you. Are you there?
Hello, yes, I'm still here.
Marvellous. Over to you.
Hi, so Graham, thank you so much for today's lecture. I just want to say that I think that's given us a really fascinating insight into your work and the work that Wessex Archaeology does. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I also just really quickly wanted to mention that if you're not already a member of the library, you can join online. It's pretty quick and easy to do. You can sign up through our website, and online membership gives you access to a really wide range of digital resources. So you can access ebooks and audiobooks, but loads of other things as well. So we've got digital magazines and also newspapers as well. And at the moment, this might be of interest to the audience today, we're currently able to offer free access to ancestry.com. So this is available through Libraries West. So if you are interested in family history or researching your own family tree or starting to write your own family tree, then this is a really great place to start, and is available online through the library service. So yes, so if you're not yet a member, do Google Join Bristol Libraries. And if you have any trouble at all, any problems with signing up, you can get in touch with us via email. So the email address is bristol.library.service@bristol.gov.uk. So if you've got any problems, just drop us a line and we'll try and help you out with that.
It's marvellous, and thank you so much, Catherine, for allowing us to share this with your audiences, which is marvellous. We're going to leave you now, and I'm going to leave you with some final footage of the Fairey Barracuda in action. So thank you, everyone. We've really enjoyed today. We'll be doing, if you want to do more of these, keep an eye on the Wessex Archaeology website as well, because we tend to do these for different organisations across the country, and we're always happy and willing to share the stories that we discover. So thank you very much, and stay safe. Cheerio.